Hello everyone, thank you for joining our webinar. We're going to be talking about building a cybersecurity strategy with Microsoft Defender XDR and Microsoft Sentinel. Just before I pass over to Mark Jones, who's our head of cybersecurity here at Chorus, I just wanted to run through a few little bits of housekeeping. So this session is going to be recorded. A copy of the recording and the slides that we go through will be shared with everyone after the event. We also have a Q&A throughout, so if you want to pop any questions into the Q&A, we will have time for them at the end, and any questions, just pop them there. Great, over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this session. My name is Mark Jones, and as Lisa said, I'm the head of cybersecurity at Chorus. Chorus are a Microsoft partner, and we're a MSP and an MSSP. So we provide managed security, and we also provide managed security services. And all of our services are really closely tied to the Microsoft tools and the Microsoft stack. And from a security perspective, we are Microsoft Intelligent Security Association members, so we're members of the MISA organization, and our MXDR services are Microsoft verified. So Microsoft have audited them and gone through our services, our threat hunting, our automation, and validated that our services are the same as they would expect from their own services. I myself have worked at Chorus for about 8 years now. I've held a variety of roles in that time. I'm mainly technical. I was on the consultancy team, so I was involved in rolling out Microsoft security for a lot of customers. I moved to architect and principal architect, so I've been involved in kind of designing and building RSOC and helping enterprises roll out these Microsoft security tools. And we've seen organizations who use Microsoft security under attack. We've seen breaches, and we've seen security improvement and what that looks like practically across our customers. So today we're going to be talking around building a cybersecurity strategy that's aligned to the Microsoft tools, primarily Defender XDR, which describes all of the various Defender products. So Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Office, Defender for IoT, and all the various tools involved in that umbrella. It's known collectively as Defender XDR, and also Microsoft Sentinel, which is the Microsoft SIEM and SOAR platform, or basically a log aggregator, which we can hinge a lot of automation off of. So to cut over to the agenda, what we're going to be covering today, really high level, what cybersecurity challenges the company face, what are common cyber attacks. I'm going to show you an example of a common cybersecurity attack. So pray for my demo. We're going to go through building a cybersecurity strategy with Microsoft Security and why you might choose Microsoft Security. We're going to go through some quick wins to get you started and how you can better protect your organization. And then finally, we're going to consider why you should maybe look at an MDR or an MXDR service to manage your organization's security moving forward. And then we've got time for questions at the end, so feel free to pop any questions in the Q&A section. So to start, we're going to go over what cyber challenges do organizations face. And obviously, everyone knows that cybersecurity is a big business priority at the moment. We have this very interesting cyber landscape at the moment where, broadly speaking, over the last few years, especially since COVID, we've seen this huge increase in the cyber attacks, the volume of cyber attacks that are attempted. And we've seen a big increase in the sophistication of those cyber attacks. Tools like generative AI bring new speed and more convincingness to a lot of these cyber attacks, especially phishing. And broadly speaking, attackers are ruthless. They don't care what industry you work in. They don't care what your organizations do. If you have weaker security, you're more likely to fall victim to a cybersecurity attack. And the name of the game, broadly, from a very high level, is making yourself harder to attack than other businesses. If you are a very expensive target for an attacker, then they're more likely to move on. Sorry, Lisa, we can go back. That's okay. So they're looking for weak targets, and we see this especially around like not-for-profits and charities are really highly targeted as they have less sophisticated cybersecurity. We've also seen the economy of cybercrime break out from people who know how to do everything to individual groups of specialists. We have specialists in initial access, in breaching your network, and then they sell that access to other actors who might be experts in malware or developing ransomware. We see kits like ransomware kits that have affiliate models. We see adversary in the middle phishing kits that you can buy on licenses that are monthly, very inexpensive. It's become quite cheap and quite easy to get hold of some pretty convincing attacks. And threat actors are very good and very sophisticated in using these. I mentioned generative AI. We've seen phishing attacks involve in sophistication and attacks against MFA increasing. There's also things like outside of cyber, we've seen phishing attacks, so voice phishing attacks increase. And we've seen a whole range of really convincing phishing attacks across the board, including quishing recently. So QR phishing, we've gotten very good in our industry at protecting against malicious URLs coming in through email. QR phishing kind of bypasses that, or it might bypass the security on a user's endpoint if they pull out their personal phone and scan it with that. There's obviously the cybersecurity skill shortage, so finding people who have a skill in this area is quite difficult. In Microsoft Security, for example, Microsoft Security, that whole journey is probably only about 5 years old now. So finding people who are very experienced in Microsoft Security is quite a difficult thing to do. But across cybersecurity in general, it's quite difficult. And it's a different skill set to IT. And I think traditionally a lot of organizations leave cybersecurity to IT teams who might not have training in how to deal with cybersecurity issues or breaches when they happen, and might make mistakes or might be overwhelmed in their main job, which is keeping things available and keeping things up and running, and dealing with the general day-to-day of keeping the business IT working. They might not be as aware, or they might not be prioritizing cybersecurity in the right way. And we have growing cyber and data regulation. So if you're a business in the UK, you're already subject to UK GDPR, you'll be subject to the DPA 2018. Perhaps, depending on what kind of sector you're in, you'll be subject to NIS. If you do business in Europe and you're on a certain vertical, you'll be subject to NIS 2. Also in the UK, we see Cyber Essentials, Cyber Essentials Plus, various ISO compliance that are very common amongst UK organizations. If you work with other businesses, a lot of them will want to see that you have these accreditations and that you have these regulatory compliance certificates in place. And to zoom in on this too, which is probably the big topic for this year, we can see that this is going to come into effect in October. Very, very important if you do business in EU, you are possibly subject to this if you're in a vertical that it applies to. And broadly speaking, we're seeing, this is a really good example of the requirements for compliance increasing. And we see this in cyber insurance as well, where cyber insurers are now asking for more and more technical controls, more and more evidence from organizations that they're doing things to protect themselves from cyber attacks. And broadly speaking, there's 4 objectives for NIS2: managing security risks. So this is policy-based things like having governance and asset management, risk management, supply chain management, making sure that you're validating the suppliers you work with, making sure that you have the right governance in place. So really a policy-driven approach to how you're managing security risk and documenting everything. We have protecting against cyber attack, which comes into obviously system security, data security, having resilient network and systems, putting the right controls in place, the right security systems in place to properly protect your environment, making sure that there's staff awareness and training, which again is part of things like ISO, but is specifically called out in NIS2. And then we have detecting cyber security incidents, which we can help you with, which is having security monitoring in place, making sure you're monitoring all your key systems or your line of business systems, and making sure you have proactive security event discovery, which really talks to threat hunting, right? Making sure that you're proactively looking to improve your security and discover things that you don't maybe have detections for, maybe your security systems can't natively detect. And to do that, you're going to need a proper security team in place. And there's also minimizing the impact of cybersecurity incidents. So if you are subject to a breach, what do? You need to have proper response and recovery planning, business continuity plans, you need to have incident response plans, you need to know what you're going to do when that happens, you need to know what roles are required from which staff, and you need to test that response. And then we have lessons learned. So at the end of all of this, we're continually improving these programs, we're continually improving our response and recovery, we're improving our security monitoring. And this is all, broadly speaking, around NIS2. And interesting with NIS2, the impetus or the person who's going to get in trouble if you're not following this directive are the executive management of your organization. So, you know, personal liability for management. So it's a very serious thing. And I think it really shows the emphasis and the increasing regulation, the increasing requirements that are placed on organizations to be compliant. If we move on to the next slide. Oh, we're going to jump straight into a demo. So before I do too much talking, I think we're going to jump straight across into a demo, and I'm going to show you an example of adversary in the middle attack. So I'll share my screen, but before I do that, just to broadly speak what I'll be doing, this is an example of a phishing attack most commonly, and we're going to look to steal some authorization tokens, some cookies, some session tokens from a legitimate user, and replay them from a different machine and log in as that user. The example here, the reason I want to do this demo at this point is A, to make sure you're paying attention, and B, to make sure that you can see in a real world example how easy some of these things are and how serious some of these things are. So if I share my screen now, Lisa, if you can tell me if you can see my screen.
Yes, can see your screen.
Great,
if anyone
thanks.
has any issues, just pop it in Q&A.
Thank you. So we'll start with conditional access, and just to show you, I have an end user machine, and all I'm applying to it is very standard conditional access. So there's an MFA required policy, and there's a block legacy auth. That's very common. That's probably the first step of conditional access. If you have customers, or if you yourself have Entra ID free, then it's very similar with Entra ID free and security defaults, where you have MFA required, block legacy auth. Maybe you'll have MFA requirements when you use some of the administrative systems. So I have this virtual machine over here, which I'm logged into, and I have this MFA user who we have those conditional access policies scoped to. And I also have this attacker machine here. So if I show you typically hacker graphics, there you go. So I'm using EvilGenX, and the key thing about EvilGenX is it's open source. I found this on an open GitHub repository, and I've copied it and I've set it up on a virtual machine. It's not very difficult to do this, and it hasn't cost me really any money other than running the machine. And then for the purposes of this demo, I'm using this domain, which is yournamecompany.co.uk, just as an example. But if I was doing this in a real life example against a company, I'd probably look to typo squat. So pick a domain name that's very similar to a domain name you'd use. If I use the example of Chorus, one of our domains is chorus.co. So I could, for example, look at chorus.co, and this is a good example, chorus.co.uk, which is very similar to our real domain, chorus.co.uk, we're just missing a dot. I could purchase for 79p, and from that point, be able to change this to chorus.co.uk and be able to do some very convincing phishing attacks. So this tool helps me create some phishing attacks, and the URL I'm trying to guide users to in a phishing attack is going to be what I can produce with EvilGenX. So I've already set up an Office 365 phishing page. and I've set up a host name which I've used a really common tactic. So I've created a lure. If I get the URL for that, oops. You can see I've hidden this phishing link behind names that users would probably expect to be associated with Microsoft 365 services. So I've hidden it behind login.microsoft365 outlook.yournamecompany.co.uk. And the yournamecompany.co.uk shouldn't really be there. That's the kind of the giveaway that it's not legit. But these are all kind of terms that users might be familiar with that is going to convince them it's legitimate. So I'll copy that, and if I come over to our machine and I go to Outlook, and we'll sign in here, and I get the traditional authenticator request, which I will approve now. I say yes to that, and it logs me into this user's mailbox. So I've provided MFA, I'm into email, and you can see a really simple example of a phishing attack here. SharePoint Online, someone shared a file with you, hit accept to have access to that file. It's a good lure. You might also see more targeted phishing against your organization. So I could look at your LinkedIn, I could look at your website, I could look at your blog, I could find some recent news or something to hinge this attack off, and come up with some mechanism for you to click on the link. If you click on the link, you're going to be directed to this URL. So you can see up here, we've got login.microsoft365 office outlook.yournamecompany.co.uk. And that's the giveaway. But you could tell it's a very convincing phishing attack. And the padlock is there that users are trained to look for. The connection is secure. Again, using open source Let's Encrypt, I'm able to get the SSL certs to make this look very convincing. And if as the user, I click on this link, this is just going to direct me to office.com. I'm not really aware, or that hasn't directed me to SharePoint Online like I was expecting, but I'm not really aware that anything suspicious has happened there. That's quite convincing, and I've just been redirected to office.com. But if we go back to our phishing machine, we can see that this key message here, all authorization tokens have been intercepted. And if I look at the sessions, I've got this session 42 here. And I'm not even aware as the attacker of the username or the password, but the important thing is that I've captured these cookies. So I've been able to intercept these cookies through this adversary in the middle attack. And this big string of text is going to be 3 cookies that I need to log in as that user. That's not very readable at the moment. So I'm first of all going to try and make that a little bit more readable. So I'll just bang this in here. And we'll copy that and put it into Visual Studio Code so we can see it a bit easier. And now away from my virtual machine, this is on my actual machine. I'm going to bring up Firefox and we'll just open a private browsing session. And I'll go to outlook.office.com. And you can see I'm not logged in as any particular user here. And I have a very simple add-in or extension to Firefox, which is this cookie editor, and that's going to allow me to import the cookies that I've stolen. So you can see I've got three cookies here, and we'll import them. Import the first one. Go and grab the second one, which like that. And then finally the last one, which is our silent snake cookie. And now we've imported those 3 cookies. If I hit refresh, we should see the big reveal, which is I'm now logged in from a different machine as that user. So I've imported those cookies I stole, and thankfully I can breathe a sigh of relief that it's worked, which is always reassuring. And you can see I'm in that mailbox. If I click up here, you can see I'm that MFA user at ChorusSec demo, and I've been able to successfully phish the user and launch my adversary in the middle attack. What am I going to do from here? Well, typically I'm going to probably set up some forwarding. I want this to go to badactor@badactor.com or whatever my inbox is, and I want to get a copy of all the email this inbox receives. I'll probably be very interested in this user's OneDrive. I'll be very interested in the SharePoint access this user has. I'm also going to want to get back into this account. So typically I will go into the account settings, and I'm going to want to look at, I'm very satisfied. If I go into security info, you will see that I can register another MFA method. So I might want to add another sign-in method, my own authenticator perhaps, or my own phone number, and make sure I can get in again, or make it easier to get in again at a later point. And that's broadly speaking how this works. Now, there's going to be detections in place for this. Some of the Microsoft tools are going to pick this up, and we're going to have a chance to respond to this. Things like adding another MFA method, things like manipulation of those authentication cookies are detected by some of these tools, and there are mitigations we can put in place. And the key one here is probably device compliance. If you require at some level of device compliance, you require users only log in from devices that are compliant, then you can effectively stop this from working. But you know, for organizations that haven't got device compliance, for organizations that perhaps are using security defaults, this is a very real attack that happens often, and it's kind of a trending attack at the moment. So we have a lot of organizations who use our MXDR services and our MDR services, and we see these types of attacks happen quite a lot. And this is valid for us however long that session's active for. So I mean, by default, that's about 8 hours. I have access to this account, and I can do whatever I need to. What we'd want to see in terms of response to this kind of thing is revoking the sessions, you know, making sure that no additional MFA has been added to that account. We want to make sure no inbox rules have happened. We want to check for exfiltration, make sure they've not managed to steal any OneDrive files or get access to any emails, set up any malicious inbox rules, and things like that. But that's a really good example of like a very real attack that happens to our customers, and something that could happen to your organization, and something we need to defend against. Lisa, if you could jump the slides back up and take control. Thank you, and we'll jump on a slide. Fantastic. So now we're going to talk again back into attackers and what attackers are doing. And we want to talk through this kind of prepare, enter, traverse, execute. We have our threat actor. Like we say, they're just looking for a payoff. They can have a number of different missions depending on what type of threat actor we're dealing with. If it's a cyber criminal, really they're looking for profit. So that might be like a ransomware attack. It might be stealing credentials that they can sell. It might be some form of extortion. We might see very sophisticated threat actors who are looking to steal intellectual property, who are perhaps looking to steal some data from your company. There are sometimes hacktivists who are looking to just destroy your data. We also see ransomware actors who often destroy your backups before they launch their ransomware, before they encrypt all your files, because they know that's going to make it much harder for you to recover. And there's even attacks where, you know, there's just cryptocurrency. the end goal is just to basically encrypt everything they can, use your resources to mine cryptocurrency. Maybe even if you are in the cloud, they want to deploy a bunch of new virtual machines to mine cryptocurrency, and you foot the bill. No matter what their mission is, they're broadly going to follow the same steps. So they're going to look to prepare, and they're going to look for stolen credentials, or perhaps they're going to look for a breach or leaked credentials belonging to a user in your organization that might have happened on a different website. But broadly speaking, there's a good chance they're reusing the same password. They're going to go for phishing mails, and they might do targeting, spear phishing attacks, trying to use something related to your organization that would make their phishing attack much more likely. We also know that emotional lures are much more likely to work. So using like a phishing scheme, like changes to employee benefits, or changes to employee expenses, those things are likely to elicit an emotional response from your users. They're more likely to click, right? Once they click the link or attachment, maybe some malware is going to run, maybe it's an adversary in the middle attack like I just showed you, and they're going to gain access that way. Maybe they can attack a website or some public-facing server. Maybe increasingly these days we see IoT devices used by attackers to sneak through networks undetected. But broadly speaking, they're going to compromise a device, they're going to compromise accounts, they're going to look laterally to see what else they can look at, and they're going to try and find domain dominance or some privileged account that they can leverage to ultimately fulfill their mission. And we're going to need detection across this whole kill chain, basically. So we're going to need to understand this whole picture and be able to detect attacks at any point. There's also other things that go alongside that. So we need technical controls in place, obviously, to spot when users fall victim to phishing attacks, but we also need to train users on what to be aware of to look for social engineering attacks. Most of these attacks are going to involve some form of human trickery at some point. So it's really important that we're making our users aware of what kind of techniques attackers are going to be using while they do this. And if we move on to the next slide, we're going to talk about why we should use Microsoft Security. So Microsoft Security obviously have emerged over the last 5 years, as I say, where they first started specializing in security to be a really huge player in the security space. And if you're already using Microsoft in your organization, then it's really a great strategy to use the Microsoft security tools. They're integrated, obviously, with the tools you're already using. They have a great understanding of the tools you're already using. If your files are in OneDrive and SharePoint, there's a huge number of detections that already understand the way your users work. There's special protections in place for things like Teams and OneDrive and SharePoint. And Microsoft Security have emerged as a leader in many of the Gartner Magic Quadrants and the Forrester Leader reports, across a huge number of security specialisms. They've emerged as a real leader. And a lot of the products are already, in some part, integrated with some of the licensing you may be using. And there's also this unmatched telemetry globally. So Microsoft own Azure, which is one of the largest hyperscaler clouds in the world, and they have all the trillion signals, 65 trillion signals at last count that they synthesize daily, and they have amazing threat intelligence, and they have their own threat intelligence organization that looks into 300 plus threat actors across the world, and really stays on track with what threat actors are doing, the types of campaigns they're running, the types of attacks they're deploying, and they have this huge access to this telemetry of all the attacks that are happening across their customers, and they can very quickly develop their tools to stop that and launch the threat intelligence to help you as an organization constantly improve your security and constantly harden your security posture against what hackers are doing. We've seen these tools developed massively in the last 5 years, and they're basically constantly improving. So, I mean, a really good example recently is they've just improved Defender for Endpoint, where they've added deception technology. So they have laws like honey tokens, honey traps, or honey pots that you can deploy, which are kind of fake virtual machines or fake accounts that when an attacker looks into them, they'll look very real on a network scan, but when an attacker looks into those things, it's going to trigger some alarm bells and give you really good high fidelity indications that someone is snooping around your network that shouldn't be. And the other reason why is because they have a very good holistic end-to-end coverage over that entire kill chain that we're talking about in the previous slide. If we step forward, we can see like kind of the pillars of the zero trust architecture. And when we talked about how historically you might have this kind of castle and moat perimeter defense, where you have everything in your network, everything in your office building, and you're protecting that behind a firewall. There's one big flaw in that approach, which is that once you're in that perimeter, everything's wide open for you. You often have these flat networks with no segregation, and also email is a big flaw in that. You can't lock down or shut the door on email. So again, you're likely to fall victim to phishing attacks and malware delivered through attachments in email. And we think about the way businesses work these days. They're distributed, there's remote working. Things are very difficult to secure when people work remotely. And we have this idea of zero trust, which is what we encourage all businesses to work towards. And zero trust isn't a Microsoft invention. In fact, it's a very old philosophy into how we should improve our security. That was originally released by the Open Group, which had like 15 tenets, and Microsoft picked it up and simplified it into 3 things, which are assume breach, verify explicitly, and assume breach as in assume that we can and will be breached, and verify explicitly as in we should take all data points that we can to make sure our users are who they say they are, and we can, rather than just use a username and password, we can use MFA. We can look at what endpoint they're using, what they're trying to access, what location they're accessing from, and use all those various data points to make sensible decisions in terms of what they're accessing. And we have these pillars of zero trust on your screen. So we have secure identities and access. We have infrastructure and development security, so securing your servers, securing your pipelines, or the way you develop code for your line of business or in-house developed tools. We have IoT and OT, so you probably have some CCTVs, some multifunction printers, some multifunction scanners, modern security operations, so monitoring your environment for any signs of breach or any compromise. And we have data security and governance, so making sure data doesn't leak out of your organization, making sure that we're protecting the sensitive data within your organization. These are all key parts of zero trust. And through the Microsoft tool sets that are included in a lot of Microsoft licensing, we have some or complete comprehensive coverage across all of these pillars with those tools. So for identities and access, in zero trust, we have this idea that we should have one common identity provider. We'd like that to be Entra, or what was formerly Azure Active Directory. We can have that as our common identity, and we can ask that all organizations integrate all of their other applications with Entra. So users have one identity, we secure that identity very carefully, and we have MFA in place, we have user risk in place, and no matter what app they're accessing, they're going to go through Entra, and we're not going to have lots of disparate sources of identity. With infrastructure, we have obviously Defender that works for securing. We have Azure tools like Defender for servers, Defender for cloud that we can use to secure those. Defender for IoT is now part of the E5 license. So if you do have switches, CCTVs, multifunction printers, you can have some good coverage of that through that. We have obviously modern security operations, so Defender and Microsoft Sentinel is the SIEM SOAR platform that can bring in all this telemetry, and we can correlate across the kill chain, across multiple different security tools to get a much better picture of what's happening in your environment. And then we have Purview and Priva, so we can look at policies, data loss protection, we can look at information protection, we can look at labeling, and we can put controls in place to stop users accidentally or willfully leaking data, and we can stop attackers and maybe being able to exfiltrate data if they are able to breach an account. And we have this overarching approach of that we know that breaches can happen and they might happen, and we're going to need to segregate our networks appropriately. If we move on to reducing cyber risk, this is a really good way to think about it. So as a kind of a thought experiment, we have this big bang in the middle, this big bang, this big breach event. So at some point there could be a breach. Let's plan that there will be a breach at some point. There'll be a big bang event. And in that case, we have left of bang activities and we have right of bang activities. So left of bang is prevention, anything that's going to prevent or stop these attacks from happening, any config changes we can make to our endpoints, any hardening we can do to stop a big breach happening. And then we have right of bang. So what can we do after there's been a breach to respond? And in that category, we fall into making sure that we have proper monitoring in place, making sure we have proper containment or response in place, that we can timely respond to these things. We have things like incident response plans and business continuity plans. And we need to make sure that we're putting proper time into both sides of this equation. So we need to make sure we're putting real effort into preventing and putting real plans into responding. So we'll jump into some quick wins and how we can use some zero trust principles to make your organization a more difficult target. And from the Digital Defense Report, and this is a stat that's raised a lot, and we know that basic security hygiene prevents against 99% of attacks. These things are harder to do in reality. If you don't have MFA in place in your organization, it's obviously very important to implement MFA, but users can be resistant. So it's important that you have executive sponsorship when you try and do these things. It's important that you have buy-in from the top down to make sure that you have the backing of management to implement these things. Patch management, again, is something that it's very easy to say, make sure you're patching your endpoints and keeping everything up to date. But it's harder to do in reality, and it requires some real time and investment and some human effort from IT teams to make sure it's happening. So the first thing to do is to assess your current security posture, get some insight into how you're doing, get some insight into how you're doing against other businesses of your size and perhaps vertical. And the Microsoft tools have some good ways to do this. So there are secure scores you can look at, which will give you a good insight into where you are against other companies that are similar to you. You can implement MFA if you haven't already. Obviously, I showed at the start of this an adversary in the middle attack that happens against MFA that's deployed. So even if you do have MFA, which is still a very good thing to do, and it's still going to protect you from a huge amount of phishing attacks. Obviously, there are ways that can be compromised as well. But it's a huge leap forward. And then another leap forward after that is going to be device compliance. We're looking for phishing resistant MFA techniques. So for example, internally at Chorus, we use like FIDO2 keys as our MFA. So like biometric FIDO2 keys that take our fingerprints. There's other MFA that are phishing resistant that you can use like that. There's like Hello for Business and other things like this. You want to get visibility of all your assets. So a lot of organizations don't know what they have. to know how they're doing. So things like network scans, things like vulnerability management through Defender for Endpoint will give you a really good insight into what you have deployed in your environment and what level it's at patching wise. Obviously, you need to carry out user awareness training. It's something you might be doing already through ISO compliance. It's something that's going to be required through NIST and NIST2, and there are some easy ways to do this. So if you just want to get started with user awareness training, the NCSC has free user awareness training that your users can do. It's not going to cost you anything to do. There's a nice website that users can follow that's going to teach them about the most common social engineering techniques that might be employed against them. That's a great way to get started if you don't have any formal user awareness training in your organization at the moment. BYOD is a big issue, so you can implement mobile application management for personal devices. I mean, you can kind of containerize business information that's kept on personal devices and kind of logically separate that from the rest of things and implement controls on those mobile applications. So if users are using Outlook or Teams on their personal devices, you can stop them being able to move data outside of those apps. You can stop them being able to copy and paste, to print. Those kinds of controls are very useful. And you can put additional security requirements on using those apps. So they might need a separate PIN, they might need Face ID to get to those apps. And then you can look to attain cyber essentials, and things like that are good things to measure yourself against. So when we talk about patching in cyber essentials, you have the requirements that critical and high severity patches in your organization should be patched within 14 days of a patch being released. So that's a good way to review your patch management and make sure that you're actually measuring how well you're doing. It's not enough to just put in place some patch management and assume it's doing its job. You need to verify that and keep track of that. And then on the right side of the bang, we have respond. So we have this assume breach mentality. We know that the average time to access private data after a phishing attack is now around 12 minutes. We know that if an endpoint's compromised, it takes roughly around 2 hours for a user to move to a second endpoint. We need to make sure that the speed of our response is the key thing. Make sure that we're responding in time. And another interesting stat is that more than 90% of attacks, ransomware attacks, are going to happen outside of your business's working hours. So threat actors know that they're more likely to succeed outside of your business hours. So we need to make sure that you have a plan in place if something happens in the middle of the night. We need to make sure we have early containment in place and we're able to stay ahead of those attacker times in terms of spotting something's happened and having some kind of containment action to prevent it going further. Obviously, we talked about the movement from like initial access to traversing the network to eventually getting some kind of privileged account. The earlier we can contain that on the left is it's going to be better for organization. We can avoid some really big breach happening, and obviously all the kind of regulatory implications of that, the fines, the ransoms, and the reputational damage that might happen to your organization. So it's really critical we have good plans in place to respond. We need some way of looking at newly released vulnerabilities and understand or make some kind of risk assessment and decide whether out-of-band action is required for some newly released critical vulnerability, or if perhaps there's some threat actor that's abusing something, and if there's some out-of-band requirements. We need processes around how we do that. There's obviously an AnyDesk breach that was announced on Saturday, where there are certain versions of AnyDesk software that have potentially been compromised. Do you have plans in place for when that kind of news is released, if you use that software, of what to do and how you're going to do it? These things are really important to have in place before these things happen. And we need to have an incident response plan, business continuity plans, and a clear process and rating matrix of who's required to do what in the event that there is a serious breach. And then there are some challenges around this response side. So obviously, you require skilled staff to do that, to interpret this constant stream of data. and look at the threats and take that risk assessment, understand where out-of-band action might be required, understand where it's not required. And obviously, we talk about over 90% of ransomware attacks happening during the night shift. Do you have eyes on your environment during that time? There's also other examples where there's been breaches of customers' cloud infrastructure for crypto mining purposes. So over a weekend on a Friday, an admin account's compromised, and they might deploy a bunch of very expensive GPU-intensive virtual machines across that organization's cloud environment. And when the team come back on a Monday, it might be too late. You know, the bill that's run up might be in excess of $250,000 by that point, if they've deployed those machines to all the different data locations available in Azure. I mean, you don't have monitoring on that, or you don't have policy to stop that. It's very important that you have some kind of monitoring in place 24/7. So it's important to ask yourself these questions. If you found a breach, what would you do? Do you have a proper understanding of your reporting requirements to the ICO, to the NCSC? Do you understand how to handle a cyber attack, or what the playbooks are if there is some form of breach? If, for example, someone gets phished and there's an adversary in the middle attack, do you know how to clean that up? Is there a plan in place to make sure that doesn't go any further, and to validate that that hasn't caused any further damage? It's really important to understand the scope of a breach before we respond to it. And then if you learn about a new vulnerability or a new breach or a new supply chain issue, do you have do you know how to protect against it? And that brings us on to our MDR and MXDR services that can help you in these matters. MDR is really pointed, or our MDR services are pointed at identity and endpoints, and that understanding that on that kill chain, no matter what breach we're really looking at, it's normally always going to follow or pass through endpoints and identities at some point. So those are really key focus areas for your monitoring. And MXDR is very similar, but we have like a wider scope. So we're looking across email, identity, endpoints, data, infrastructure, everything essentially, to make sure that we have that same response and that same visibility. In our MXDR and MDR services across all of our customers, we have maintained a lower than 5-minute mean time to acknowledge, and a lower than 20-minute mean time to close. And in fact, in the last month, that time is closer to a 3-minute mean time to acknowledge and 17-minute mean time to close, which puts us ahead of the industry average, and it puts us ahead of the attacker times as well, importantly. And we're very proud of those times. If we jump a slide. So next steps and resources. Obviously, I talked about user awareness training. If you don't have user awareness training, and then there's a link to the NCSC's free cybersecurity awareness training, which is a great starting point, great website for your users to use. And the Microsoft Digital Defense Report is a great way to understand what's happening in the threat landscape at the moment. And Cyber Essentials, if you're interested in looking at it, you can look at it in more detail there. We can help you understand or assess where you're at the moment. If you know that you're subject to NIS2, you might want to understand what work is required to get you to be NIS2 compliant. We can help you with that through a Microsoft Threat Check assessment, which kind of gives you a clear view on your environment and where you're at. And also we can give you a MDR and MXDR demo, and you can have a look at our managed security services and how they can help you. We also have a great partner network, and our partners are also able to help you with deploying the tools, looking at gap analysis, and how you can deploy or replace point solutions that you might want to move to Microsoft 365 security. And then we'll move on to Q&A. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thanks, MJ. Just seen something pop up in chat, just saying downloading presentation and shared recording. That will all be emailed to everyone either later today or if not tomorrow morning at the latest. So yeah, a copy of all the resources will be shared. I'm just going to go through a couple of questions, just conscious of time, just in the Q&A. If anyone wants to pop any in, if we don't get round to them today, we'll be able to come back and answer them. So one that I have got here is what's a good way of measuring your security posture with Microsoft?
I think Secure Score I mentioned earlier is like a really good way of reporting how you're doing in security to like the management of your business. It's a really good way to understand or measure how you're improving, and it doesn't require you putting a whole load of extra monitoring in place or metrics in place to monitor. There's lots of different secure scores. So there's device scores, which are focused on the endpoint. There's like secure score for identity that just focuses on identity. There's overall secure scores, and there's lots of inbuilt scores that you can use. There's also things like the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark and Defender for Cloud that can give you a really good view. That's probably a great place to start, and then you can look at TBM data to see how you're doing, like in terms of patching. But that's probably the best place to start.
Amazing. The response service, I've got a question. What Microsoft licensing level do you need for the response service mentioned?
So it depends on the service you go for. So our entry-level service is MDR for endpoint, and that just requires basically Defender for Business or Defender for Endpoint P2 licensing, and that to be rolled out to your organization, which we can help you roll out, or our partner can help you roll out. And that's the only requirement there. If we move up to like our MXDR services, then we look at like business premium licensing and up. But we'll basically cover Microsoft and Azure tools at that level. And then we have a further service that also targets like non-Microsoft third-party sources that you might be interested in bringing in, which is basically we'll work with what you have.
And just one more before we wrap up. How does Microsoft Security Copilot fit into the security product?
Okay, so Microsoft Security Copilot is still in private preview, and we're quite lucky to be a part of that private preview. So we've had access to it for a long time. It is basically a generative AI solution that can speak to all the various tools that we've been speaking about. So it can talk to all the Defender tools, it can talk to Sentinel, it can talk to Entra, and it can kind of help us with our investigation and our response to incidents. So, I mean, the way we use it at the moment in private preview is that we can teach it our playbooks or our processes for how we respond to certain incident types. And it can basically run through prompt books and do a lot of that investigation for us. Also, the language that we use to speak to logs in Microsoft is something called KQL or Custo. And that obviously requires some technical ability. We can kind of teach Security Copilot our KQL functions and our queries that we use as part of our threat hunting, as part of our incident response. And our analysts can call that in natural language. So, I mean, broadly speaking, Security Copilot is a really easy way to speed up triaging incidents. It can also like collate reports. You can ask it information about your organization from a TVM perspective, like patching information, and it can very quickly correlate a lot of information across a lot of different solutions in the Microsoft ecosphere. So, for example, with that adversary in the middle attack, I could ask it to run through a playbook, or I could ask it questions. I could ask it what device is this user on? Who is the user? Have there been any new MFA methods registered? Has there been any unusual sign-in attempts? I could ask it questions in natural language, and it wouldn't need to know all the technical. It can already extrapolate all the technical queries it needs to do across multiple different tools to find out that information for me. So that's basically where Security Copilot fits in. It's just a tool to speed up using all of these various tools.
Amazing. I think we'll wrap up there just for time. Thank you. As you mentioned, the recording and slides will all be shared shortly. And if we didn't get a chance to answer any of your questions, or you have any other questions, if you just reply to that email, we will be able to help. Or if not, our partner network will be able to help. Thank you very much.
Thank you.